Okay, I want to take a closer look now at object replacement. Object replacement tool is very important when you're creating complex scenes because what you can do is make some temporary objects, which can be simple shapes, and then replace them later with more complex objects. So it's a good way to sort of create your scene very low res, and then you can go in and swap things out later. But there's a few things to take into consideration while you're doing that. And first, let's take a look at the way object replacement works. I'm going to go ahead and load in 4 boxes here, just to kind of demonstrate the different types of object replacement and the way they affect certain objects. Okay, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these last 2 right here, and I'm going to go ahead and stretch those out because depending on the size and the scale and the way that certain objects are sort of manipulated, we can get a different effect for object replacement, whether or not we're scaling it or not. Okay, so there's 2 different types, and I'm going to go ahead and click on this first box right here. We're going to take a look at the first type. If I right mouse click on that object, we're going to have our replace by options, and we have replace by keep proportion and replace by fit object. Let's go ahead and do keep proportions for our first set here, and we're going to replace this with an object. So we're going to click load object. And now this is going to bring us to our objects we already have loaded into view. We can go in and import a new one if we want. We could also select the import load or import object if we wanted to, but I'm going to replace it with this futuristic building 2 we have under architecture, and click OK. And now in order to really see how that affected maybe the scaling, let's go ahead and do the second one. We're going to replace by keep proportion, load object, futuristic building 2. And you can see that this one is stretched out more because we actually stretched the other box. So even though we're keeping the proportions, we're really not keeping the traditional size of the object. So keep in mind when you're doing object replacement that you don't want to manipulate your objects if you have the correct sizes for them. So let's take a look at the second option here. Let's do this back row. And we're going to replace, and this time we're going to fit the object. And we're going to go ahead and go to load object. We're just going to use the same one, futuristic building 2. And you can see the object is now fitted to that box we had in there, which is more stretched out than the other one. And actually the only one that is the actual size right now that the original one was created at is this first one we did, because we did not manipulate that cube and we used the keep proportions tool. So we'll go ahead and select the next one now and back, and we're going to do the fit object again and just load that in. And now you can see we have it a lot bigger than the other one, and that's because we have our object fitting to that specific object. Now this works with any object you're using, whether it's a cylinder, or you can also replace these with other objects if you wanted to, and you don't just have to load them in. But we can see just the way that the way object replacement works. So if you're creating a city, you might not want to go in and make these boxes as representations of buildings stretched out. Because if we stretch this out, because that's the size of the actual object we have there, if we try to keep the proportions, it's just going to go ahead and stretch that object out. So what we have to do is make sure we keep it back where it started with our original object. What we could also do, if you wanted, is if you wanted to fit everything, because you know the actual size, then you could go like that and go back into the scaling and sort of set it back down to its default. In this case, it's a 36.575. And now we have the same size that we had originally started with. So you could always change that back when you want to replace the objects, and that way you get the correct size. But it's definitely something to take into account when you're working on object replacement. Another neat kind of thing is if you have, let's say you wanted to create sort of a terrain in a background of a nice scene you created, but you don't want to tie up any system resources because you're not sure exactly where you want to place it. And instead of loading in procedural terrain, which can take up a lot of space, and let's say you have already a large scene full of procedural terrains, what we could do is just use a box. And say you wanted it in the distance, I'll just go ahead and zoom out on our views here, and we'll position it where we want it and where we want that terrain to be. And we could also adjust its size and kind of put it right there. And we know we want the terrain to be right there. But let's just pretend we have all this other stuff in the scene, and we don't want to, like I said, tie up our system resources because of all the stuff that's already in the scene. So what we can do is just position this cube here and go to replace by, and we'll just keep proportions in this case, or we could fit the object, whichever way you want to do it. And you could do it with the terrain. So now we have that terrain being replaced. We'll just go ahead and drop that down. And now we have our terrain where we sort of lined up our object. So it's a good way to sort of place things. If you're not sure exactly where you want them to be and you just want sort of a low-res object, just as kind of a reference before you go in and make your scene a little more polygon heavy.